This past weekend, I jumped pretty far outside of my comfort zone and tried something new within the miniature painting universe for me. I entered a real big deal, super legit painting competition for the first time called the Crimson Brush. I should reiterate, I didn't just enter the Crimson Brush for the first time. This was the first real legit painting competition, and it just so happened to be the Crimson Brush. And aside from it being a fantastic experience overall, the results really surprised me. Frankly speaking, I've never really spent so much time on any individual model before. When I started with this autark, I didn't really know where I wanted to go with it. I had a very rough idea of what I wanted to build and kind of that I wanted to put more of my all into the model, but I didn't really know where that would end up. This ended up culminating in months of work, spaced out pretty sporadically, many decisions gone back and forth on, and ultimately being happy with the execution of some things and disappointed and having learned from others. I started the build process for this guy with the element that I was ironically both the most inspired and confident in to begin with, but the element that failed me the most in the end. And I think for this kind of style of painting being, competition pieces, this was the element that made me learn the most, and that was the base. I knew the rough pose for the autark and the fact that, I wanted him jumping down with his big angelic wings, and I wanted to essentially sculpt the base to emphasize that, kind of going from a low point on one side and tapering in a diagonal all the way to the top of the model on the other. Unfortunately, I don't think this ended up suiting me because the focal point of the model being the autark himself, it led a lot of negative space on one side and drawing the focus in some of the wrong places. But anyway, the build process for this was fairly simple. I built up a base of cork sheets on top of my makeshift plinth and covered that in milliput that I could then just kind of sculpt into the shape I wanted, as well as press in some pieces of the Games Workshop supplied Eldar bases that I'd cut away from other Eldar models I had or bases to add those elements around the base. And then also sculpted some stones of milliput, so some odd alien looking circular stones that I could set up stacked on top of each other. Now, I was a few months out from the competition at this point, and I really didn't have a good idea of how long I was actually going to take or how burnt out I would end up being, so I wanted to get paint on the model as soon as possible. I hadn't really decided on a color for the armor just yet, so I decided to work on the head first. I started out by tackling the white, which started with a base of blue-green and pastel blue from AK Interactive through an airbrush just to create a base layer, and then using stipple highlighting, so just creating tiny brighter dots. I gradually built up a transition all the way up to white in the brightest areas. This includes varying the viscosity of the paint all the way down to essentially a glaze consistency in some points, and tinkering back and forth across the lines of transition to really make sure that it's smooth. To put it in perspective, I would say painting just the white of this helmet probably took me about 6 hours to get right. But do take into consideration this kind of technique is newer to me, so I'm much slower with it, and there was more back and forth than someone that has more experience in these techniques than me. The next thing that I kind of really want to spotlight was the armor, because this was something that was incredibly contentious for me and probably took the most time out of this entire process. I was going back and forth on exactly how I wanted to do it, how flat I wanted to do it, the style that I wanted to do it in, the color, but I ended up settling on the original concept, which was pretty much a almost metallic finish. I used Vallejo model color violet as a base and then just gradually mixed in more and more aka 3rd gen pastel blue. And nothing groundbreaking technique-wise, pretty much just the same way as the helmet was done, just gradually built up the highlights through thousands upon thousands of micro dots that are all fairly transparent. So it's essentially just stipple glazing to get a smooth, consistent blend. Nothing was perfect. I did go back and forth a bit between the darker and lighter mixes, but having it all on a wet palette just made that pretty simple, so long as I stuck with, doing one leg at a time that kind of thing. This process did take forever though, so I did end up breaking it up with just briefly moving to different steps here and there in between so as I didn't go completely insane. Now, like frankly most of the elements of this model are, I was a bit stumped on what to do with the banner. I did have an idea that I wanted kind of a geometric pattern on it as a background and then some kind of Eldar heraldry over the top of that, but I didn't know exactly the way I wanted to go around it. My first attempt was a massive failure. I tried using the nail art stamp technique that I've used on some things before, but I wasn't able to get as consistent of a finish, and frankly it just looked messy. So thankfully I do this with oil paints, so I'm easily able to clean that off, and I ended up just freehanding a kind of spiral checkered pattern and then applied multiple Eldar transfers kind of layered over the top of each other, and then once sealed with some varnish I was able to go in with a brush and add shading and some texture over the top of those transfers to really blend them into the rest of the banner. Now, as I'm sure you've probably noticed by now, but I've been skipping showing a lot of steps in the process, like the fact that now all of a sudden the armor is pretty much a completely different color, as well as having the blending essentially completed. Now, I didn't record the vast majority of this model purely because I was going back and forth on decision making. I wasn't sure about things, and frankly, recording painting makes it much more difficult to do well. But having grinded out the rest of blending up the armor, I honestly decided I didn't like the color, which was a little bit heartbreaking. I didn't want to completely redo the whole thing, so I basically looked at what I had and winged it. I put a very, very thin pass of Vallejo Fluoro Magenta over the top of the armor to change the tone of it and brighten it up, make it more punchy, and honestly, I fell in love with the color. Obviously, this did mute down some of the highlights, but it helped blend together some of the stippling as well. So all I really had to do was just re-establish those highlights just with the brightest layers that I'd done before, but now I just added a tiny bit of the fluoro to keep the tone about the same. Around this time, I'd started experimenting with some of the other elements as well, the non-metallic gold, changing and fixing up the checkered plume on the helmet, as well as a few other elements, and I figured it was a good time to attach the helmet, some of these things, and just make sure everything was just kind of cohesive at this point. After this, I really just committed myself more to getting the model done as opposed to trying to record anything, essentially. So there are kind of periodic updates with massive spaces of time in between, but I was just trying to check off individual elements as I could because I was doing all of these small parts over the course of weeks. Once I could consider the Autarch himself done, it was time to do the base. I consider myself really bad at actually painting bases and deciding on colors and cohesive ways to paint things such as dirt and whatnot. So considering most of the model had a very cold palette, I just decided I wanted the opposite. So I went to my AK paint rack, picked out all of the warm greens, grays, and browns I had, and just started throwing down colors until I had something I was kind of happy with. Aside from that, I have some kind of birch pod leaves that I ground up to make smaller and kind of more in scale, as well as the fact that I added some tufts. The only difference I made to them was I trimmed them down so they were much shorter, and I added an oil wash to sink into the base and change the coloration so it's not just one solid color of grass the whole way, which adds a ton of realism. Then I was able to add the Autarch himself to the base, and from there spend the next few weeks after going on holiday just kind of picking at pieces that I wanted to elevate here and there and not really stress about him too much, which frankly was a nice place to be. Now is time for the big day. The Crimson Brush is held at CanCon, which is a trading card game, wargaming, roleplay, you name it kind of convention that's held in Canberra every year at the end of January. I dropped off my Autark and registered early and then was able to have just a quick walk around the event to see what was what, because I haven't actually been to this one in quite a long time. Surprisingly to me, certain games have just blown up in popularity around here. There were events for the Lord of the Rings miniature game that were huge. The Age of Sigmar tournament had multiple hundreds of people, and there are other tournaments happening for games that I didn't really realize had such big communities. This event packed out 3 massive halls as well as multiple other small buildings around the showgrounds, and also included multiple rooms in between the big halls and in second stories, which was where the Crimson Brush was held. The Crimson Brush also apparently had its biggest year ever, and it was huge. There were hundreds of entries. One of the really cool things about the Crimson Brush is they live streamed the whole thing, including the judging process. The Autark made it on stream twice, once where 2 of the organizers were going over miniatures from the category I was entered in before the judging process started, and then of course once where the miniature was judged. I don't think I've seen another painting event do this, and I think it's a really cool format to actually give people some feedback as opposed to just a did you win an award or did you not, and not knowing why. It was kind of funny to see the Autark get quite high praise in the pre-show and then lovingly torn apart in the judging.
Really cool piece, super fun. We'll love to see how the judges go judging this one out.
Yeah. Composition is like, just doesn't work. Something has to be. Yeah. I reckon that these will work. Need quite a contrast.
But I do want to preface by saying by the time they'd gotten to my miniature, they were running behind time, so they were having to judge models and give out verdicts quite quickly. I think most models unfortunately only got 10 to 15 seconds on stream by the point mine was judged. But mine started with the judges saying this.
Yeah. I want to talk about this one for a little bit as well because it's quite good. I would like to critique this slightly more cheaply. This base, this is very cool. The composition is like, just doesn't work. It's way off to the side. There's so much empty sequence. Yeah, and importantly, nothing happens. Yeah. Like maybe this works really well if there's something here, so you have this line.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
Yeah.
But it's actually just a focal point, and then I really like the hue of the rock.
Yes.
The color is really nice. Yeah, probably could use a little bit more detail. Like these edges need to be picked out. All these little runes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To cover the composition a bit of it. Okay. All these little runes, they're very nicely dark lines, but there's just no highlight. Something has to be.
Yeah.
I reckon that these will work. Need quite a contrast. The wings.
Yeah, a bit more shadowing underneath them to really bring out the individual.
You got this crazy purple kind of magenta armor right next to this white. You should see some reflection in that light. There's a lot of good stuff to do. This needs something on the back, this banner. It just doesn't work. Anyway, the volumes on the armor, really nice. Color choice, very well. The banner works really well.
Yeah. The helmet is outstanding.
Really, really nice.
Yeah.
Great, that's highlight, isn't it?
Yes.
And I like how clean the checkered
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Plumes.
The plume.
And then last but not least, the spear could use a lot more time on these edges.
Yeah.
So just highlight. I can see that there's a highlight there, but it's nowhere near bright enough to be effective. Lovely. Gold.
Yeah.
Gold?
Same.
So yeah, it's hard to not get in my feelings watching my piece be torn apart on live stream, but remembering I think this is in the vein of, hey, this is good, but here's some things that you could elevate to make it even better. I do really appreciate the feedback. And frankly, if I had people to kind of go back and forth on before entering pieces or finishing pieces like this, I probably could have had these things caught out for me beforehand anyway. Some of these things, it's just kind of hard to see them yourself when you've stared at a model for 50 to 100 hours. Frankly, I agree with most of their criticisms. The back of the banner, yeah, I got completely lazy. Looking at the blade now, 100% I could push it a bit brighter. The wings, I did actually make the choice to push more shadow and contrast in there than was originally there, but I do kind of agree that, yeah, it's not really enough to stand out. The composition, frankly, I like, but I can see why other people don't. I am also quite happy that the things that I put a lot of time and effort into to try and really get right were appreciated. The helmet took forever, and considering it was a real focal point on the Autarch himself and kind of the brightest point, I wanted to make sure that that was as clean as it could be. The armor itself, both the highlighting of all of the volumes, the placement of the light, and the color took a long time and a lot of stress, and them mentioning it in only a positive way was a major win for me. To have gone into my first kind of major painting event like this and not know what to expect and come away with not only a gold award, but also a really great welcoming experience is just a overall feeling. I'm super happy I decided to jump into this, and it's kind of safe to say that I'm hooked. If you have a chance to enter the Crimson Brush or any event like this, really, I'd highly recommend it, just because the community we have around this hobby is so fantastic, and the more activity in it, the better, really. I don't really have too much else to say, so other than thank you to the people that ran the Crimson Brush, I want to thank you guys for watching the video. If you liked it, please do subscribe, because only a small percentage of the people that watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel. And with that, I will see you guys in the next one.